Chapter 1. The Rescue. The evening sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a soft, fiery glow across the barren landscape of the desert planet. Marcus stood atop a sand dune, the wind whipping through his dark combat suit, his gaze fixed on the compound below. The military-grade exosuit that enveloped his frame felt heavy, a constant reminder of the battles he had fought, the wars he had survived. But today, as he stood on the precipice of yet another mission, there was something different in the air. This wasn't just about completing an objective. This wasn't about taking down enemy forces or securing resources for his commanding officers. This mission was personal. It was about someone who had been wronged, someone who had been stripped of their freedom, and someone who deserved a chance at life beyond their captivity. Marcus had heard the stories of the slave trade that ran rampant across the galaxy. Alien species from distant star systems, each more exotic than the last, had been rounded up, captured, and sold to the highest bidder. They were nothing more than tools to be used, their rights ignored, their wills broken. But when the intelligence had come through, when he had received the order to infiltrate this particular compound and rescue the girl they had locked away, it had hit him in a way he hadn't expected. He wasn't just here to liberate an alien girl. He was here to destroy a system, to put an end to the vile practice of slavery that had so many victims across the galaxy. And he was going to do it one step at a time. Starting with her. Marcus took a slow, steady breath, inhaling the dusty air that filled his lungs. There was no turning back now. The mission was set into motion, and he couldn't afford to hesitate. The intel had been spot on. She was held deep within the heart of the compound, a heavily fortified prison built into the mountainside. He was outnumbered, under-resourced, and isolated. But what he had was skill, years of training, combat experience, and the gut instinct of a soldier who had learned to read every situation like it was a battlefield. And Marcus knew that no matter how hard it got, no matter how impossible the odds seemed, he wasn't leaving without her. His helmet's heads-up display blinked to life, giving him a real-time map of the compound's layout, schematics for the security systems, and a countdown of how much time he had before the next scheduled patrol passed his position. The compound was a fortress, and it wasn't just the walls that posed a problem. The slaves know. The people who had been brought here were more than just workers. They were subjects to be controlled, broken, and used for the amusement of their captors. And the guards, heavily armed and merciless, were more than ready to kill anyone who even thought about rebelling. Marcus had fought wars in hostile environments before, but this felt different. This wasn't about winning a battle, it was about making sure the people who lived in chains could experience the taste of freedom again. This was a fight for something greater. He crouched low as he approached the compound's outer perimeter, watching for any movement. The last thing he needed was to be caught in an open area. His eyes scanned the darkened valley below, searching for the guards on patrol, and the faint lights that flickered in the distance signaled that they were still operating under the guise of normalcy. He moved like a shadow, silent and fluid, slipping through the cracks of the security systems and avoiding the guards' line of sight with ease. His exosuit enhanced his speed and reflexes, making him a near ghost in the night, and his training ensured that no corner went unchecked, no door remained unbreached. It took Marcus a solid hour of moving stealthily through the terrain before he reached the entrance of the compound, a heavy metal door reinforced with laser security locks. He scanned it quickly, bringing up his hacking tools, and within moments, the lock clicked open, the door creaking as it slowly gave way. He could hear the faint hum of the internal systems coming to life, the drone of cooling vents and electricity coursing through the compound, feeding the vast network of security cameras and weapon systems designed to make any escape a death sentence. But for Marcus, these were all just obstacles to be bypassed. There was no room for failure. Inside the compound, it was eerily quiet. The walls, dark and metallic, seemed to swallow any sound. The only light came from dim ceiling fixtures, casting long shadows across the narrow corridors. It felt like a tomb, a place where lives were not only wasted but erased. Marcus moved through the hallways, every sense heightened, his rifle held tight in his grip. The further he ventured, the more he felt the presence of the guards. But they weren't aware of him yet, and that was all he needed. He reached the first set of holding cells, each one encased in reinforced glass, and he paused. The prisoners inside were not what he expected. Alien species from every corner of the galaxy, their faces and features a mix of exotic colors and shapes, some peaceful, some fierce. They all shared the same vacant look in their eyes, a look that spoke of years of suffering, of lives destroyed and memories erased. It was impossible to know the full extent of their stories, but Marcus didn't need to. He didn't need to see every tragedy to know that the fate of every single one of these beings had been sealed the moment they were brought to this place. And then, his eyes locked on her. There she was, crouched in the farthest cell, hidden in the shadows, her slender form barely visible in the dim light. She was smaller than the others, her skin a vibrant shade of violet that glowed faintly under the illumination. Her eyes, wide and filled with a strange mix of fear and defiance, met his, and for a moment, everything stopped. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat, something in him reacting to the deep sadness and the sharp fire in her gaze. She wasn't just a victim here. She was someone who had fought back, someone who still had a spark left inside her. Marcus didn't waste a moment. He knew what needed to be done. The guards would be on their patrol route soon, and the longer he lingered, the more likely it was that the whole compound would go into lockdown. He activated his comm link, transmitting a signal to his extraction team, but he didn't wait for a response. The plan was simple: get in, get her out, and get to the extraction point. He used his advanced hacking tools to disable the cell's locking mechanism and silently stepped inside, making his way toward her. The moment she saw him enter, the girl stiffened, her eyes wide with disbelief and caution. Marcus held his hands out in front of him, palms open, showing that he meant no harm. "I'm here to free you," he said, his voice low and calm, but there was an urgency beneath his words. "We don't have much time. The Queen's men will be on their way soon." For a long moment, she didn't move. Her eyes flickered to the door, to the guards outside, and then back to him. She seemed to weigh her options, whether to trust this stranger, whether to risk whatever freedom he offered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice a soft whisper. "Why?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Why are you helping me?" Marcus took a step closer, his voice gentle yet firm. "Because no one deserves to be a slave. You deserve freedom." He held out his hand, and she hesitated for a moment, but then, without a word, she reached out and grasped it, her grip surprisingly strong. The moment she touched his hand, something shifted. It wasn't just the physical connection. It was something deeper in understanding, a bond forged in the fire of their shared humanity. She was no longer just a prisoner in a cage. She was someone who had been freed, someone who had a chance to reclaim her life. They didn't have much time. Marcus pulled her toward the exit, moving quickly, methodically, as he had done countless times before. But as they reached the main hall, the compound alarms suddenly blared, signaling a breach. The guards, no longer unaware of the escape, rushed toward them, weapons drawn. Marcus cursed under his breath, but the girl, her face a mix of fear and determination, didn't flinch. Her eyes locked with his, and for a brief moment, he saw something he hadn't expected: confidence. Without a word, she moved, swift as a shadow, her hand reaching for a concealed weapon. Marcus didn't hesitate. Together, they fought back, a whirlwind of motion and precision. She moved like a warrior, quick, fluid, and precise, taking down guards without hesitation. Marcus, trained for combat, moved with her, clearing the path toward the extraction point. Finally, they reached the outer gate, the guards barely holding their ground as they sprinted toward the transport vessel waiting on the outskirts of the compound. As the door slid open, Marcus and the girl jumped inside, breathless but alive. "Where to?" the pilot asked, his voice a static crackle through the comms. Marcus glanced over at the girl, who now stood by his side, her expression fierce and unwavering. "Anywhere but here," he said, his voice full of resolve. "Take us far away from this place." The ship shot off into the sky, the lights of the compound fading behind them. As they ascended into the dark expanse of space, Marcus turned to the girl, who had not moved from her spot by the window. She had been freed from her chains, but something in her eyes told him that her journey was far from over. She had been given a chance at freedom, but now she would have to decide what to do with it. And Marcus knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next, she would not be alone. As the stars stretched out before them, he turned back to face her, a sense of camaraderie settling between them. "You're free," he said softly. "What's your name?" Her eyes met his, and a faint smile tugged at her lips. "My name is Lyra," she said, her voice stronger now, no longer laced with fear. "And I'm not going anywhere." Marcus nodded, the weight of their shared moment not lost on him. The battle for freedom was far from over, but for now, they had won. As the transport vessel ascended into the cold void of space, Marcus couldn't shake the lingering feeling that things were far from settled. Lyra sat beside him, her back pressed against the cold metal of the ship's hull, her eyes staring out into the stars as the compound that had held her captive faded into the distance. The light from the galaxy stretched out before them, an endless expanse of twinkling stars. But for Lyra, this was the first time she had truly looked at the universe with a sense of freedom. No longer was she a slave to cruel masters or shackled to a life of exploitation. She was free, but freedom came with its own cost, its own weight. Marcus didn't speak as he piloted the ship into deeper space. He focused on the controls, his mind running through every potential danger ahead. They were not out of the woods yet. The Queen's forces would be in pursuit, likely already preparing to track them down. Slaves did not escape without consequences, and Marcus knew that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who were already a few steps ahead. The sound of Lyra shifting in her seat broke through his thoughts, and he glanced at her, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the ship's control panel. There was something about the way she looked at him, something that made him realize just how much more complicated this mission had become. "You saved me," she said, her voice soft, barely a whisper over the hum of the ship's engines. "Why? Why would you risk your life for me?" Her eyes met his, the question in them both sincere and wary, as though unsure whether she was worthy of such a gesture. Marcus adjusted the controls, his expression impassive. "You're a person, not property," he said, his tone firm, though it lacked the hard edges of a soldier. "No one should live like that." He turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze for a fleeting moment. "I've seen too many people suffer. No one should be forced to suffer in silence." Lyra studied him, her face hard to read. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, her gaze distant. Then, her lips parted, a faint but meaningful smile forming. "You know," she began, "I never thought anyone would come for me. I thought I was meant to be a shadow, to exist in the dark corners of this galaxy without a voice. But you didn't just come for me. You gave me the chance to escape. You gave me the chance to fight." Her words hit Marcus more than he was willing to admit. He had been trained to never let his emotions get in the way, to remain detached, focused on the mission at hand. But Lyra's raw honesty, her acknowledgement of the freedom she had been granted, was something that pierced the armor he had built around his heart. This wasn't just another rescue operation. This was something real. The kind of freedom Lyra spoke of, the kind of hope that burned in her voice, was the same fire that had once fueled him as a soldier back when he had believed in fighting for something greater than himself. And it reminded him that even amidst the violence and the chaos of his career, there was still room for something pure, something that made the war he fought worthwhile. Marcus cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "We need to get to the Outer Rim. There's a station there, a smuggler's hideout. It'll be off the radar of the Queen's forces, and we can figure out what to do from there. Lay low, keep moving. No more staying in one place for too long." Lyra nodded, her eyes narrowing as she processed his words. "And after that," she asked, her voice quiet but resolute. "What happens then?" Marcus looked out at the dark expanse ahead of him. "After that, we figure out what to do with the weapon." The words hung in the air, unspoken but powerful. The weapon, the one that had been the key to her captivity, the reason she had been enslaved and subjected to such horrors. The reason Marcus had been sent to retrieve her, to free her from her chains. The Queen's obsession with the weapon was not just a desire for power. It was a pursuit of control over the galaxy. And now that Lyra was free, the most important question was no longer whether she could escape, it was what she would do with that freedom. Would she help Marcus fight the Queen? Or would she vanish into the galaxy, leaving the battle behind? Lyra leaned back in her seat, her eyes focused on the stars once more. She had been silent for a long while, lost in thought. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. "I want to help you," she said softly, her voice unwavering. "I won't hide. I won't run from this. I've been running for too long. I want to help you stop the Queen. I want to help stop whatever madness she's planning." Marcus glanced at her, surprised by the conviction in her voice. It was as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders, like the very act of freedom had unlocked something within her. It was one thing to be freed, but it was something else entirely to choose to fight for something greater than oneself. Marcus could see it in her eyes now, the same determination that had led him through countless battles. It wasn't just the freedom she had been given that made her strong. It was the strength to stand up and fight for what was right. "We'll need a plan," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with a new sense of purpose. "The Queen's forces will be after us. We can't just sit around waiting for her to catch up. We need allies. We need a place to regroup, a safe haven where we can figure out our next move." Lyra nodded once more. "Then let's get there," she said. "We have a long way to go." Chapter 2. The Path Forward. The smugglers' hideout on the Outer Rim was nothing more than a dilapidated station perched on the edge of an abandoned asteroid belt. The facility had long since been forgotten by most, a remnant of a time when it had served as a neutral zone for travelers looking to evade the law. Now, it was little more than a decaying structure, filled with the echoes of those who had passed through its halls, seeking refuge from the chaos of the galaxy. It was the perfect place to lay low off the Queen's radar and far from the prying eyes of the Empire's forces. Marcus and Lyra arrived at the station in the early hours of the morning, the ship's engines sputtering as they docked at the makeshift port. The air was thick with the metallic scent of rust, and the dim lighting cast long shadows across the walls. The station's interior was eerily silent, save for the occasional hum of machinery that had long outlived its usefulness. The walls were covered in dust, and the floors creaked beneath their boots. But despite its dilapidated state, the station offered one thing: safety. As they stepped out of the ship, Marcus kept his guard up. He had been here before, on similar missions, and he knew that in places like this, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. There were always risks, always enemies lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Stay close," Marcus said, his voice low. "We need to find the smuggler we came here for. If anyone here is willing to help, it's him." Lyra nodded, her hand resting near the hilt of a small weapon she had taken from the compound. Her eyes were alert, scanning the surroundings as they moved deeper into the station's bowels. She had been silent for most of the journey here, her mind clearly occupied with the weight of what lay ahead. But Marcus could feel her resolve growing stronger by the minute. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was a fighter. As they walked through the empty hallways, their footsteps echoing off the walls, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. He had been in places like this before: smugglers' dens, hideouts, places where the law didn't reach, and the only rule was survival. But there was something different about this one, something that made him uneasy. It wasn't just the decrepit condition of the place. It was the feeling that they were being watched. "Do you feel that?" Lyra asked quietly, breaking his thoughts. Marcus paused, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Yeah," he said, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. "Stay alert." They reached the heart of the station, a small bar area where the only patrons were a few alien figures hunched over tables, speaking in hushed tones. Marcus approached the counter, where a large, gruff-looking man stood cleaning a glass. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of them. "You lost?" the man asked gruffly, his voice thick with a local accent. Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We're looking for Garan," he said, his tone cold and direct. The man paused, his eyes flicking to Lyra before settling back on Marcus. "Garan doesn't take kindly to strangers," he said. "But you're not the first to ask for him." Marcus leaned in, his eyes hard. "We're not here to play games. We need help." The man looked between them for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Fine. Garan's in the back room. But if you're looking for trouble, don't expect me to help you." Marcus didn't reply, merely nodded and moved past the counter, his focus now entirely on the back room. He could feel Lyra close by, her presence steady and unwavering. She had been through hell, and yet here she was ready to fight for something more. Marcus didn't know exactly where their path would lead, but with every step, he knew one thing: they were no longer alone. They were fighting for something greater than survival. They were fighting for freedom, and that made all the difference. The back room was dimly lit, the walls covered in grime and peeling paint. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and stale alcohol, and a single bulb overhead flickered intermittently, casting long, erratic shadows on the worn tables and mismatched chairs that filled the room. At the far end of the room, behind a makeshift desk cluttered with old datapads and various alien trinkets, sat Garan, the smuggler Marcus had been looking for. Garan was a towering figure, his broad shoulders encased in a worn leather jacket, his face framed by a wild mane of unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. He looked up from his work as they entered, his sharp, calculating eyes scanning them both, but he didn't say a word. The silence between them hung thick for a moment, as if Garan were measuring them, sizing them up like prey or potential partners. Marcus didn't wait for him to speak. He had learned long ago that time wasted could be deadly. He stepped forward, his voice firm, his tone sharp. We need a ride out of here. Off-world. As far from the Queen's reach as possible. And we need it now. Garan's gaze shifted to Lyra, who stood silently by Marcus' side, her posture tense but not submissive, her eyes scanning the room for threats. He studied her for a moment, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face, before returning his attention to Marcus. You're looking for a quick getaway, huh? Garan finally spoke, his voice deep and gravelly. You sure you know what you're asking for? Marcus held Garan's gaze, unfazed by the question. We're not asking for favors. We're paying for the ride, and we're paying well. We don't care about your politics or your problems. We just need to get out, and we need to make sure the Queen's men can't catch us. Garan let out a low chuckle, a sound that rumbled through his chest like a distant thunderstorm. The Queen's men. He leaned back in his chair, eyeing Marcus and Lyra with a newfound interest. You're either braver than I thought, or a whole lot more desperate. His eyes locked with Lyra's for a moment, a knowing glint in his gaze. You're a long way from home, kid. Lyra didn't flinch at the comment. Instead, she stepped forward, her voice steady and firm. We've already been through hell to get here. Now, we just need to keep moving. Garan studied her for a long moment, as if weighing the truth of her words, then nodded slowly. All right, he said, pushing himself to his feet with a groan. I've got a ship small, fast, and untraceable. It'll get you out of here, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There's no such thing as a safe getaway when you've got the Queen on your tail. It's a long shot, but if you're willing to risk it, we can get you out of here. Marcus nodded without hesitation. We'll risk it. We don't have any other choice. Garan smirked. Of course not. Follow me. He turned and led them out of the back room, through the dark hallways of the station, and into the docking bay. The station had been built in a forgotten corner of the galaxy, far from the reach of major governments, and the ships parked within the bay were just as varied and strange as the people who used them. There were freighters in various states of disrepair, old cargo ships with rusting hulls, and sleek, high-tech transports that seemed out of place in the rundown facility. Garan's ship was a mix of both small, agile, and surprisingly well-maintained, though it carried the scars of many years of dodging authorities and hostile forces. The ship's hull was coated in dark, weathered paint, and its engines hummed quietly as they approached. It looked unremarkable, but Marcus had learned not to judge a ship by its appearance. This one was built for speed, built to outrun anything the galaxy could throw at it. And that's exactly what they needed. Garan led them up the loading ramp, and as they entered the ship, the doors closed behind them with a heavy thud. The interior was cramped but functional, with just enough room for the three of them and the essential equipment to keep them alive during the journey. A small cockpit at the front of the ship housed a single pilot's seat, and the rest of the ship's interior was filled with equipment blasters, crates, and supplies that spoke of a life lived in constant motion. You're not going to like it, Garan said as he strapped himself into the pilot's seat and began running diagnostics on the ship's systems. But this is the fastest way to get out of the Queen's reach. It's risky, but we'll be in and out before they even know we're gone. Marcus took a seat next to Lyra, his eyes scanning the ship's systems and its strange alien controls. How soon can we leave? He asked, trying to suppress the anxiety building in his chest. Garan's voice crackled over the intercom as he activated the ship's engines. A few minutes, tops. But once we're off the planet, you'll need to stay low. No comms, no transmissions, just keep your heads down until we're clear. Marcus glanced over at Lyra. Her face was set, determined, but there was something in her eyes that spoke volumes about the uncertainty she was feeling. She had been freed from the compound, but now, she was facing an entirely new set of challenges. She was no longer a slave, no longer a prisoner, but freedom didn't come without its own price. The Queen wouldn't stop chasing her, and she would be a target for anyone who sought to use the weapon she had carried. It wasn't just a fight for survival anymore, it was a fight for her future, and Marcus was now tied to that fight. As the ship's engines roared to life, lifting them off the surface of the station, Marcus leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. There was no going back now. They had made it this far, but the true test was just beginning. They were heading into the unknown, with enemies on every side and no guarantee of safety. But for the first time since the mission had begun, Marcus allowed himself to believe that they might just make it. Chapter 3. The Escape. The stars outside the ship's viewport streaked by in streaks of light as the small vessel tore through space at incredible speeds. The throaty hum of the engines was constant, a reminder of the velocity at which they were traveling. The ship had been built for speed, and the way it moved through the black void was a testament to that design. There was no way the Queen's forces would catch them in this ship, not unless they were much closer than Marcus had expected. Marcus was seated in the cockpit, watching as Garan expertly maneuvered the ship through the asteroid field that lay ahead. The terrain was treacherous, with rocky debris and large chunks of floating matter scattered throughout the expanse, but Garan's hands danced across the controls with the ease of someone who had lived a lifetime in the shadows. He didn't have to say a word. Marcus knew the drill. They were staying off the radar, weaving through the asteroid belt to avoid detection. Lyra sat in the back of the ship, her back against the wall, eyes wide as she stared out at the passing asteroid field. She had barely spoken since they had left the station, her mind clearly preoccupied with the weight of everything that had happened. Freedom at last. But it wasn't as simple as just escaping. There were people after her, people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. The journey was long, the silence stretching between them like a tangible thing, but every minute that passed brought them closer to safety, or at least as close as they could get. It was a journey filled with uncertainty, but also with the faint glimmer of hope. They were heading toward the outer rim, away from the Queen's territories, where the galaxy's most dangerous smugglers and fugitives sought refuge. But even as the ship rocketed through space, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, a storm on the horizon that they wouldn't be able to outrun. The Queen's agents were skilled, relentless. They wouldn't stop until they had what was theirs. And as much as Marcus wanted to believe in their escape, a part of him knew that this fight was far from over. Stay sharp, Garan's voice came over the intercom. We're not in the clear yet. I'm taking us through some old trade routes. We'll stay low, but if we get caught, we're done for. Marcus turned to look at Lyra, who had remained quiet for most of the journey. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp, alert. She was ready, and so was he. They would fight to the end, together. The silence in the ship was almost suffocating, the only sound being the low hum of the engines and the occasional soft clang of something shifting in the cargo hold. Marcus had learned over the years to embrace the quiet. It was in these moments when the adrenaline had faded, when the danger of combat had passed, that the weight of everything he had done, everything he had seen, settled on his shoulders. But now, as he sat at the controls of the ship, guiding it through the asteroid belt with expert precision, he couldn't shake the feeling that this peace was fleeting. They were far from safe. The Queen's forces were swift, and while they had made it through the initial phase of the escape, there was no telling how long their luck would hold. Lyra's figure moved in the background, her silhouette faint in the dim light of the cockpit. She had barely spoken since they had taken off, her face haunted by the past, by the memories of captivity and the life she had once known. Marcus knew it would take time for her to process the enormity of her freedom. The galaxy she had been thrust into was vast and brutal, and while she had been freed from the shackles of her captors, the weight of that freedom came with its own set of dangers. He glanced over at her briefly, catching her gaze for a fleeting moment. There was an undeniable intensity in her eyes, a quiet strength that had emerged since her rescue. She was no longer the scared, fragile girl in that holding cell. The fire of defiance had been kindled in her heart, and though she was still navigating this new reality, Marcus knew she was capable of far more than she realized. The ship jerked slightly, breaking Marcus' train of thought as Garan's voice crackled over the intercom. We're going through a dense field, he said, his voice sharp with concentration. Stay low and keep your seatbelt on. The next few minutes will get a little bumpy. Marcus nodded, adjusting the controls. The asteroid field they were navigating was more than just a cluster of rock and debris. It was a narrow, treacherous route that many smugglers used to avoid detection. But even the best navigators had to be on their toes. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and they would be nothing more than a ship turned to scrap in the cold of space. Lyra's hand gripped the armrest as the ship jolted again, the inertial dampeners struggling to keep up with the ship's rapid movements. She glanced at Marcus, her eyes wide but focused. It was clear she was learning to trust him, even though there was still a guardedness about her. Her time in captivity had shaped her, molded her into someone who wasn't just a survivor, but a fighter. Marcus saw the subtle shift in her posture. She wasn't just here to be saved anymore. She was here to help. Minutes passed, and the ship threaded its way through the dense asteroid belt with careful, deliberate movements. Garan's voice was the only sound breaking the silence, offering quick updates on their location and the course they needed to follow. Marcus kept his hands steady on the controls, eyes flicking between the instruments and the view of the asteroid field outside. The stars beyond the belt beckoned, offering them the promise of escape, but Marcus couldn't help but feel the gnawing suspicion that they were being watched. There was always someone out there, waiting, watching, ready to strike. Suddenly, a sharp ping echoed through the ship, and Marcus' heart skipped a beat. A warning flashed on his HUD. A ship was approaching fast, too fast to be ignored. He activated the ship's sensors, scanning the area for any signs of pursuit. "Damn it," he muttered, his mind racing. "They found us." Lyra stood up, her body tense, her hand instinctively reaching for the weapon she had hidden on her belt. "How long until we're out of this field?" she asked, her voice calm but urgent. "Not long," Marcus replied, his eyes flicking over the control panel. "But it doesn't matter. They'll be on us the moment we break free. Then we fight," she said, her tone firm, resolute. "We don't stop running until we're safe." Marcus glanced at her, surprised by the determination in her voice. She wasn't asking for protection, she was ready to stand beside him and fight. She had come a long way since he first rescued her. This wasn't the frightened girl who had been trapped in a cage. This was a woman who had tasted freedom and wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. "You don't have to dash," Marcus began, but Lyra cut him off, her eyes fierce. "I'm not a prisoner anymore. I'm not running." Her words were final, and there was no room for argument in them. Marcus couldn't help but feel a surge of respect for her. He had always fought alone, never truly understanding what it meant to have someone beside him, someone who fought not just for survival, but for the same thing he was fighting for. "All right," Marcus said, his voice steady as he powered up the ship's weapons systems. "Let's do this." Chapter 4. A New Alliance. The ship tore through space as the asteroid field behind them became a blur of jagged rock and dust. The enemy ship was gaining ground quickly, closing the distance with every passing second. Marcus gritted his teeth, pushing the ship's engines to their limits as they broke free from the dense field and into open space. But as soon as they cleared the asteroid belt, the pursuing ship was on them, its sleek, deadly form emerging from behind the debris, ready to engage. "Brace for impact," Marcus shouted, as he veered sharply to the right, narrowly avoiding a blast from the enemy ship's weapons. The ship rocked violently, the force of the near miss rattling them all. Lyra held her ground, her fingers clenched tightly around the console as the ship shook. She had never been in combat before, never faced the kind of violence Marcus had lived through, but now she was here, fighting for her life, and she was ready to stand beside him. Marcus had to hand it to her, she wasn't backing down. She was more than just a survivor. She was becoming his ally, someone who would fight just as fiercely for her freedom as he would for his own. He could sense the shift in their dynamic. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. This was a partnership, a new alliance born out of necessity, but one that had the potential to go much further. They needed each other, not just to survive, but to win this fight. The pursuing ship fired again, this time scoring a direct hit to their shields. Sparks flew from the console, and the ship jolted violently, sending both Marcus and Lyra off balance. But Marcus didn't hesitate. His hands moved over the controls, his fingers flying across the keys as he adjusted their trajectory, weaving the ship through space to avoid the next round of fire. "Incoming," Lyra shouted, her voice sharp and filled with urgency. "Hold on." Marcus gritted his teeth as he pulled the ship into a hard dive, sending them spiraling downward as enemy fire shot past them. They were close now, close enough that Marcus could see the weapons on the enemy ship charging up, preparing for another attack. This was their last chance to make it out alive. The enemy ship was faster, more powerful, and they were running out of options. Marcus made a quick decision. It was dangerous, risky, but it was the only chance they had. "We're going in," he said. "Prepare for a hard turn." Lyra's eyes widened in understanding. "What are you, Dash?" But Marcus didn't wait for her to finish. With one last sharp turn of the controls, he sent the ship hurtling toward the enemy vessel, right into the line of fire. The ship's weapons powered up, and Marcus held his breath. The explosion was deafening. The explosion echoed through space like a thunderclap in a vacuum, the shockwave reverberating across the vast emptiness. The enemy ship, caught off guard by Marcus' daring maneuver, erupted in a flash of light as their weapons systems failed in the wake of the direct hit. Sparks and debris scattered in every direction, the remnants of the once pristine vessel disintegrating in the cold expanse of space. The ship rocked violently as the shockwave from the explosion hit them, but Marcus was ready, his hands gripping the controls with practiced ease. The view outside the cockpit was filled with flashes of fiery debris, but he didn't let up. His eyes stayed locked on the control panel, calculating their next move. He could feel the sweat running down his brow despite the cool temperature inside the ship. They were not out of danger yet. Lyra, still holding onto her seat, turned toward Marcus, her face flushed from the adrenaline but determined. "Did we get them?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief. The explosion had been massive, but Marcus wasn't about to celebrate until he knew for certain. Marcus watched the damaged hull of the enemy ship begin to spin off into space, slowly losing momentum. "We've bought ourselves some time," he said, his voice low but steady. "But they'll send reinforcements. The Queen won't let us slip through so easily." Lyra nodded, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the empty space behind them. The fear she had felt moments ago had been replaced by something else, a quiet understanding of the fight ahead. She wasn't just a slave anymore. She was a warrior now, forged in the fire of this brutal galaxy, and her resolve had solidified in those moments of danger. Marcus guided the ship away from the wreckage, maneuvering toward a small, hidden jump point marked on his map. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. Even though the enemy was disabled, they would soon be able to send out distress signals, and the Queen's fleet would mobilize. They had to get to the outer rim, far beyond the reach of any military forces, and figure out what to do with the weapon they had taken. As the ship surged forward, Lyra turned and faced Marcus, her expression firm. "We can't just keep running. What are we going to do when we're clear of them? What happens next?" Marcus' eyes flickered with a mix of determination and uncertainty. He had never been one for long-term plans. His life as a soldier had been about surviving the next fight, the next mission. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about stopping something bigger than them both. "We need to find allies," Marcus said, his voice tinged with urgency. "There are groups out there, rebels, factions who've been fighting the Queen for years. They might have the resources we need, and they'll understand the importance of the weapon. We have to make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands." Lyra's eyes softened as she listened, and for the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of something like hope in her expression. She had been a slave for so long that the idea of trusting others, of relying on someone else, was foreign to her. But now, with her freedom gained and a new purpose to fight for, the uncertainty was slowly being replaced with a newfound strength. "We'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice resolute. "We'll stop the Queen. We'll stop her plans." Marcus turned to her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "We're in this together. Whatever happens from here on out, we're fighting for the same cause." The tension in the cockpit eased slightly, the bond between them solidifying with every passing moment. They were no longer two separate individuals, an ex-soldier and a freed slave. They were partners now, united in their shared goal. They were going to take down the Queen, no matter what it cost them. As the ship approached the jump point, Marcus punched in the coordinates, and the engines powered up with a low hum. The stars outside began to stretch and blur, and with a sudden jolt, they were hurtling through hyperspace, the familiar void of their surroundings replaced by the shimmering blue lines of the jump. Lyra settled back in her seat, her eyes fixed on the stars streaking past them, her hands resting on her lap. "So this is it?" she asked quietly. "This is the start of the end?" Marcus nodded, his hands still firmly on the controls as they navigated through the jump. "This is only the beginning. We've got a long way to go before the fight is over. But together, we'll make it." And with that, they continued on their journey into the unknown, the ship a tiny beacon of resistance in the vast expanse of space. Ahead of them lay the uncertain future, filled with dangers and challenges they could not yet fathom, but also with the possibility of hope, a hope that, despite everything they had faced, they could still make a difference. They would fight for freedom, for justice, and for a future where no one would have to live in chains again.